So, what are we going to cover today? First, what school avoidance is. Then, why certain students are missing school. $1 million question. Then, what decisions schools need to think critically about. Those 2 slides are really important slides, which I would ask you to take back to your districts and think about. And then the other thing is about interventions you can use to connect and why focusing on family patterns is key. And the case example that we're going to do, that's going to be interactive. I'm going to present a case and I'm going to ask you all to talk about it together on the individual level, the school level, and the family level, and we'll have a discussion. And then I'll share some of my thoughts about that case. Let me just tell you a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know. I've been a child psychiatrist for 30 years. I've worked with school districts for that much time. I was a teacher, preschool through 3rd grade, science in Harlem, for in between medical school and college and medical school. And that's where I learned how hard it is for teachers. And shout out to them, because unlike me as a psychiatrist, I do 1 hour and then the patient disappears, the family disappears. They have to wait a week to find me. And I found out that being confronted by some of the struggles day in and day out is incredibly challenging. My other background is, some of you may have seen me doing threat assessments, what I choose to call safety assessments, which I did for over 25 years. So when you were talking about mental health issues in the school and how we deal with it, that's a time when you really see that sometimes. So that's another thing of my background. And then I worked in a school-based health center for 23 years, where I had a lot of experience of working with students who had school avoidance. And I'm happy to be here. So what you're looking at here is the slow, steady progress of a turtle crossing. And I think what we're going to hold today is the urgency to get kids back in school. We know every day that a kid misses school, they're losing ground. And the startling statistic that we heard, which is, did anyone in the back room hear what I just said for the last 20 minutes? No, okay. We're talking about school avoidance, getting in the door. Okay, now we're talking about the fact that turtles move slowly, but if they don't move fast enough across the street, they're going to get smushed. And it's the same metaphor for kids with school avoidance, that many times it takes a lot of work to get them in the door, and there's that tension because we're going to lose traction, and it's tough on parents, it's tough on educators. And at the same time, I invite you to keep in mind the wins and the positive shifts, which we heard about just now, that you've guided families that have lifted your spirits. While I'm talking, if there is something that comes to you about a child, like we just heard from Erin, about a turnaround moment when you may have made a difference in school avoidance, I'm going to collect them and do something at the end with them. And also, if you put down anything that you take away from this lecture, because I think it's really important to reinforce what we learn. I forgot to mention in my introduction that I also teach a Harvard freshman seminar, and I asked my students to draw a picture of depression, and this is one of the pictures that a student allowed me to share with you. And I think what you're looking at is a student in a cage, but what I want to draw your attention to is the shining light that's coming from inside the heart. And which is a reminder, I think, both of the urgency of being locked out of school sometimes, locked in your room, and a reminder that each of our students has an inner light. And that's what we're trying to ignite. This already, we got, the Secretary mentioned that the pandemic still has lingering effects, so I'm going to move through these, that slide, because that's just a reminder to me to tell you that. And this is just looking at the Massachusetts data, which again, the Secretary said that, the x-axis, what you're looking at is the x-axis is the school year, the y-axis is the percent of kids missing 10% or more of school days, and the top line is Boston, and the bottom line is the state. And so, as he mentioned, we're doing better, but not good enough. But we're making progress, which is something we want to remember. So, what is school avoidance? That's a good question. First of all, it's not in the DSM. So it's not in the quote-unquote psychiatric Bible. That's facetious because it's a little bit of a, it's made by consensus, so it's got a lot of political elements to it. But that can sometimes be a problem because you may have students that can't get coded for insurance, which makes the work of the school counselors and the school social workers so important because sometimes they can't access services easily. There are multiple overlapping terms that are used: chronic absenteeism, school phobia, school refusal, school avoidance. Truancy, actually, we will not be dealing with, and I'm going to show you the differences. And I don't really think that the naming of it really matters. What really matters is our interventions and our sustained effort. So, we are going to be looking at school refusal, which is usually anxiety, depression, or somatic symptoms with particular distress triggered around school. And often kids want to be in the comfort of their own homes, and the child will do homework or school instruction. And when we have truancy, it's often thought of as volitional, and they may find school boring and look for more rewarding activities outside of school. And that's another bowl of fish. So we're going to steer the course. So what's the million-dollar question for school avoidance? And the million-dollar question is the student motivated to avoid something in the school, or is it that there's a desire to stay home? And of course, maybe it's a little bit of both. But that's really, I think when we have these meetings, that should be top on the agenda, figuring out, because it's going to really drive your intervention. If it's a desire to stay home, then the work, even if we think that as schools we shouldn't be doing this, really is about supporting the families to set limits. It's about helping, which I'll talk about later, about becoming curious about what's going on in the family in a non-judgmental way, that you can help support them coming together. We're going to look at the outcomes of chronic absenteeism. I'm going to wheel through these, but it's, I'm actually going to do a thought experiment with you as I'm sharing these results. 1/3 of youth are treated for difficulty with school attendance, continue to have problems years later. 30% have continued to meet criteria for psychiatric disorders, 1/3 10 years later. So they're at risk for delinquency and school dropout. And the predictors of dropout are psychiatric comorbidity, adolescent employment, and low socioeconomic status. And they're at risk for problems of adulthood. Now, what I think is so interesting about us as educators is, at least for me, what I gravitate to is, oh my God, 1/3 of the youth treated for difficulty with school attendance continue to have problems a year later. But what that means, it's not good, but it means that 60% of kids resolve their school avoidance. And that's because of the work that we're doing. So it's really important to hold on to the progress that we make with so many students. That was my thought experiment for y'all. So why do certain students miss school? This slide think about if when I'm talking, if there's certain categories that I brush over, if there are questions you have about particular students, because every single category that I tell you, I have a story to tell and have dealt with. So, individual factors are trauma, anxiety, neurodiversity learning disorders. That's a sore spot for me. There's so many kids who might end up avoiding school because they haven't been diagnosed with a learning disorder, particularly nonverbal learning disorder, kids on the spectrum who may not be getting significant amount of intervention to turn them around and then they avoid school, and substance use. That's another one that sometimes gets missed because as school folks, we don't always screen for that, and it can be a hidden thing. With school factors, poor communication with parents, school culture and bullying. And with family factors, the one I would underline is high conflict divorce. You want to see a kid who decides not to come to school, they really want to make their parents pay for the fact that they can't come to an agreement. And domestic violence, and another place is permissive parenting. And that's always a little bit judgmental, permissive parenting, but the struggle, I have a lot of compassion for that because I work with kids who may have been suicidal or psychiatric hospitalized, and sometimes you have parents that are afraid of setting a boundary and a limit because it may end up that they lose their child. And the fear that their child may kill themselves makes it really hard for them to set a limit. So we have to provide a huge amount of support for them. Community factors, unsafe neighborhoods, lack of social support. So sometimes kids avoid school because of fear, both of school violence and individual violence. So what you see up there is that 6% of students 12 to 18 reported avoiding school activities or classes or one or more places in school during the previous school year because they thought someone might attack or harm them. So if I put on my safety assessment hat, threat assessment hat, one of the things, and I've done national trainings around that, one of the things that some schools do is they ask students, they give them a map, and they ask students to circle the areas that they think are unsafe. Just to get, because you may not know that it's actually the bleachers near the track or the cafeteria or the recess area. And one of the things we talk about in terms of trying to decrease bullying in the behavior code is sometimes for these kids having a recess plan, because it can be so hard to navigate for some of these kids. And some kids may miss school just because they don't want to have to manage recess. And then for LGBTQ students, there's a higher rate. And as I was driving here, because I'm taking out my phone, y'all, don't realize, and I was driving, I'm taking out my cheat sheets. I was driving, and I encourage you all, how many of you have people on speed dial? One? Oh, okay, let me just give you a quick tip. Put 3 people on speed dial. Those are the people you call when you have something like a conference today, and you're calling them and you say, hey, give me a heads up. So how many of you know Jeff Perotti? Okay, no one, good, I'll introduce, oh, whoops, raise your hand if you know Jeff Perotti. Okay, tell me who Jeff Perotti is, please. Oh. Yes.
Well, he's just one of the lead advocates for LGBTQ plus students in the state, and we work with him at DESE, and we love him.
We love him, okay, hear that, shout out to Jeff Perotti, and he's also probably spoken with you all, I'm sure. So I called him because he's on my speed dial, and I'm like, okay, Jeff, I'm gonna do a shout out to you. Tell me 2 practical things that I can say to you all. So I'm sharing you what he said, because I texted it to me so I wouldn't forget. And he's a lovely man. You can find him, we have him in the references, and he also works with the Safe Schools. He's now consulting the schools and only, but Safe Schools gives free in-service programs to schools. If you have an LGBTQ, something that's happening where you need some more support. And these are tips, he said. 2 tips. Take them home with you. Perotti, P-E-R-R-O-T-T-I. R-O-T-T-I. And it's on the last reference if I took out the R. So what he said was interesting to me because it's also what I talk about in doing threat safety assessments. Friends. He said, no matter what age, K through 12, figure out if a kid is feeling isolated, marginalized, enhance their opportunity for friendship. And that may mean you need to orchestrate it. And I can tell you, just taking a little detour, also highlighting it, Sandy Hook, after Sandy Hook, which was in 2012, a fourth grade teacher started to do sociograms. Sociograms meaning you sort of say to a class, who would you invite to lunch? And then they say, and she would identify the child in the classroom who wasn't invited to lunch. And I can guarantee you that Adam Lanza probably was not invited to lunch. And then, but the important thing is around the intervention piece. Figure out how to increase the social capital. And so Jeff told me two stories that I thought were really moving. One was about a transgender student who wanted to wrestle in his school. And Jeff said he was giving a talk to the athletic directors in the state. And it was the student's moment to say, who made a difference when you started to wrestle? Now, you would have thought he would have said, the athletic directors, right? But he didn't. He talked, can you hear me in the back? Cool, okay. He talked about Xavier. Xavier was the wrestling captain and was going into the Marines. And what he told this student is, anybody messes with you, tell me, I'll deal with it. So that's one really important point. The second point that Jeff said was parents. Right now, all of us know, and I'm praying all of you are voting. I won't say for who, but right now we have so much division in this country. And many times the message is that the parents are pitted against the kids, and particularly with LGBTQ kids. And so his message also was, reach out to the parents, even when you think that the parents may be asking you to do things that you feel are unethical. He said, move them towards acceptance, but reach out to them. And I know from having worked in a school-based health center for 23 years, it is really easy as a clinician when you're in a school setting, which I was, it's a school-based health center, to get pulled into the vortex of a student. But my deep belief is family is the best medicine. Family is the best medicine. And that the Family Acceptance Project, which looks at research, says if you can decrease hostility between the parents and the children by even 15%, that can be life-saving. So, okay. Friends, parents, that was his message. Okay. So most research, I'm always looking in my research around what's the bumper sticker, right? Most research looks, when you look at school avoidance, and believe me, I've done so many lit search on school avoidance, primarily what you see are clinical samples. So it's kids who've already been identified with mental health problems or have a clinical diagnosis, and then you start to look at them. And this was different, this Havik study that I'm going to tell you about. Because the Havik study looked at, in Norway, 6th to 10th grade, 5,500 students. And they looked at non-attendance in 3 months, more than 10 days. But the interesting part was, they asked, from the parent's perspective, what do you think would help with school avoidance? And that's what I wanted to share with you. Because what it talked about, and we sort of know this as educators, is it came down oftentimes to the teacher's ability to structure the classroom, And the ability of teachers to clarify rules and expectations. And in the mind of the parents, that's what shifted school avoidance. And I can tell you, having done safety assessments for 25 years, you could take a child who was wildly out of control in one classroom, put them in another classroom with another teacher, and they look different. So one of my interventions was switch the student to the cut your losses. And I could do it, right? There's all these political things in terms of if you're in the school, you can't really do that. But if I were able to say so please don't inundate me with threat assessments. If I could write in my recommendation that this is what is needed, just what these parents said, then sometimes you could make a switch and you could see a change in the student's behavior. Not all the time, but sometimes. So I like that study, and I'm sharing it with you, and it's in the references when you get the PowerPoint, which you will get. The second thing was the parent-teacher home visit project, which came out of Johns Hopkins and Steve Sheldon, and they looked at 100,000 students in 4 different districts across the country. And they put this intervention in where they had teachers paid and trained to go and do random home visits. So it didn't have to be that you had a school avoidant child. And what they focused on, and I think this is important for us, is they focused on the honey. They were heavy on the honey, light on the vinegar. And what that meant is they asked parents, just like you were saying, what do you want from your child? You want your child to learn decimals. That's what you want. So they focused on the positive hopes and dreams that the families had. And how many times do we approach a student and we start with the problem first? I read a study, which if you start, and I just look for studies to support common sense, but just bear with me. Okay, I read a study that talked about if you start an individual ed plan, here's another concrete suggestion, start with the positive thing first. Then go in to all the problems that you're seeing. But that's really important, and that I can tell you, I've been at so many IEPs. That is not reflexive in a school district. That is not where we start. And oftentimes, and some of it's required, we go through all the problems, and then people are like, oh God, I've got 10 minutes until I gotta get to my next meeting. So really be conscientious if you are managing. So this is a shout out to many, I don't know, different districts do different things, but the school psychologists who may be chairing, do time management. Think about how you spend your time with families and go heavy on the honey, light on the vinegar. It doesn't mean brushing over things, but common signs that can increase school avoidance. So this is another cheat sheet. Many times, and I've had a case that I used as a teaching case, the major problem, well, let me ask you all, how many of you would say that school avoidant kids have the biggest problem when they come into the school? Just raise your hand. Is that where you see the hardest, where kids get stuck? Do you see my question? Nobody's raising their hand though. So you don't see that problem. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, one person does, 2 people do, 3 people, 4. Do you not understand my question?
I think well.
What's your name?
Lloyd.
Good morning, Lloyd.
So I think I understand the question, but as someone who works directly with attendance issues, when I go do a home visit, I realize, oh, this is the safest place on the planet for this student. And sometimes, because of what is going on at home, it keeps them from the safest place on the planet. So a lot of times I have students who are dealing with other issues that keep them from coming into school. So a lot of times it isn't the school situation for some students. it's all that external stuff that they're dealing with.
That's beautifully said. Thank you, Lloyd. So he's saying, don't forget that when I do a home visit, which I've done home visits too, especially humbling, right? You go in and you think, okay, I'm Dr. Rappaport, I'm a part-time associate professor at the time. You know, I'm going to be able to get this kid out the door, and then you're there for an hour. Like, actually, no, that's not happening. You know, it's humbling. It's humbling because you realize it makes you so much less judgmental of the parents because you're like, oh, this is hard. You know, you've got a kid who says, no, I'm not opening the door, I'm not coming out. And so I appreciate you highlighting this. So I'm not going to argue with you, you're right. So let me, but let me say, this is more saying, if you have a student who's really struggling to come into the school, these are the things that are in my differential that you may end up seeing, and I want us to be thinking about. So you may see anxious behaviors where the transition of going from home into the school is so difficult. And where I have seen people make interventions is, for one case that I worked on, it was a student who would become so aggressive coming into the school because she had a hard time leaving home for some of the things that you're talking about. But she loved a gerbil. And so she became the person who was responsible for bringing the gerbil in the class home and bringing it back to school every day. That got her in the door. So it changed her. She had gotten aggressive, and she'd been, unfortunately now it supposedly doesn't happen in schools, but she'd been restrained. So the anxiety and the aggression went in this fueled circle, and being able to intervene that was really important. So anxiety and aggressive behaviors often go hand in hand. A kid doesn't come to school with trauma imprinted on their forehead, and they may have anxiety that then flips into aggression. So if any of you aren't familiar with Bruce Perry's work, excellent work, great YouTubes, and he wrote a book with Oprah. He's a child psychiatrist that I adore, and he talks about, instead of why are you behaving this, it's the question, what's going on? And that's a quick teaching point that you can tell teachers to think about in their repertoire when they approach an anxious or an aggressive student. Is it's counterintuitive to ask a kid when they're starting to escalate what's going on. It's usually like, why are you doing this? The other thing is parents' reaction to child difficulty. So as I mentioned, the SPACE curriculum, which is Ellie Leibowitz's, which looks at how to help anxious parents, anxious kids. Guess what the intervention is? Parents. They don't even care if the kid comes in and they're able to show that they're able to turn it around. So what we often see with parents is accommodation, you know, and so that they keep accommodating for the anxiety. And so what we want to be able to do is give them the support so they have a distress tolerance when their child says, I'm not going in, and starts to escalate. Can they convey the confidence that this child has the capacity, has the golden light to get in the door? It's kind of like walking like you got the gold in your pocket. And then school officials' reactions to parent and child. Sometimes what happens, and it's okay, I think it's really important when you have your attendance team meeting to do a check-in around whether you're getting sucked into the blame game. Because there is nothing more compelling for us. We are educators. Our job is to get this child to learn. And if the child isn't in the room, sometimes it's like centrifugal or gravitational pull to start to blame. So just doing a check with the team about where are we with that, you know. So what I'm going to talk to you about next is how do you elevate your school culture to problem solve? So this is another concrete thing. So I'm going to go through each thing that I'm discussing: information sharing, climate that allows for mistakes, and family-school relational partnership. So Sarah Goodrum is an amazing psychologist. I worked with her around threat assessments, and her work was looking backwards after a student had come in and killed a teacher. And she was a sociologist. She reviewed 4,000 pages of records. She interviewed all the school personnel. And this was transformational for me as someone who had spent 30 years analyzing the individual kid that was struggling, that what she looked at was, what is the school environment that may create the potential for a school shooting? And what she talked about, and you all know this, schools that are struggling often silo information. The left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. So information sharing is really critical. And clear communication, identifying a point person that's going to be communicating to the family and to the child. And I would say another thing that I take from my research on doing threat assessments is keep an eye out for power struggles. That happens in school settings. When you have a kid who's missed a lot of school and then they come into class and they end up being disruptive, you can have shaming that happens. You can have, some teachers can really support the transition, and some teachers really struggle with it. So keep an eye out for when there's a power struggle, which is going to interfere with information sharing. And pivoting to care and concern as much as possible. I would say also that the climate that allows for mistakes. So that's not just between school and family, but between the support team. That you can have school personnel that may struggle more or be triggered by a certain student, and that can create a negative cycle. And I think the school cultures that do well build in an allowance for that. I mean, if you have had a teenager in your house, and I've had 3 of them, they're all now big, but being able to pass off to my husband was really critical for me to get through those years of teenagehood. And I think it's similar with students that may come in when they finally do get to school, and they may be provocative, and trying to figure out as a school system, how do you support each other? The last thing is around family-school relational partnership. And I mean, you know this, it's going to sound sort of cliche, but parents are always doing the best that they can, what they think is best for their child. And I don't think this is something that our school culture has embraced yet. And I'm encouraging us to think about it, and especially those of you that are from the echelons of the Department of Education, to think about how are we building the skills in the families to tolerate distress? What are we doing in that way? And I had this one, I run this HMS School Mental Health Conference in January. Happy to have any of you guys show up, the Harvard Medical School Mental Health Conference. And I showcased a wonderful administrator from a district where he worked hard with so hard, he still worked with a school avoidant child that I was working with. And I think any clinician should take on the hardest kid, again, to stay humble around, this is not a quick fix. You're going to tear your hair out. You've got to stay hopeful. And what he shared was he helped the mother feel heard. And how did he do it? And I bet you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I bet you there's some people in this room that are doing that, or some people online, hello. He called the mother every day on his way to school. I'm not going to put you all on the spot, but that's an incredible commitment, right? And there are school personnel who are doing that. And that helped to lower her temperature and improved her feelings about the district. What I would say, having been on the other side of working with teenagers, is some kids, I would give them controlled choice. So I would say to them, do you want me to text you or do you want me to call you? Now, some school districts won't allow you to text, so delete that. But, or they will say, do you want me to call you or do you want me to call your mother to help you get out the door? So just a caveat with that. And then he talked about, because I know this mom, and she can be volatile when she feels powerless. And sometimes she would scream at this administrator. And he confessed. Guess what? Sometimes he would scream back. But this is the part about rupture and repair. The next day he would call and he would apologize. And I just think that idea, we don't talk enough about the challenges that can happen sometimes with staying engaged with parents. And I appreciated the administrator's honesty about that, and that's why I'm talking about it. So here we are. What key decisions do schools need to think critically about? Take a look at documentation and communicating about absences excused versus unexcused. And here's the thing. In elementary school, that's often when school avoidance happens. And many times you have parents who write excused absences. And so that doesn't get put in sometimes to a kid missing school. So that's just a tip-off to you all. And I'm going to talk later about how district-wide Todd Rogers has introduced how you document and communicate with parents next, after this. All right, how many of you have this trouble about how much to modify homework expectations when a kid finally gets back to school? One person, two, any, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'm going to just pick on you. Hello, good morning. Can you, what's your name?
Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie. Can you tell me how it works with the homework expectations? What's a case that you might come to mind where you try to?
So I work at a high school, and oftentimes when kids come back after extended absences or school avoidance, I'm the one, or not oftentimes, most of the time, I'm meeting with teachers trying to modify assignments because we want them to come back to school. We're trying to find that balance. I want you back in school, but you're overwhelmed because you missed so much work, and how do we get you caught up and back into the classroom? So it's a challenge for sure. And it's also, if I'm being perfectly honest, sometimes it's like, well, if you didn't come to school, why do you think you get to have this excused? You need to be here. But it's, again, it's a balancing act.
Yes, a balancing act. And can you, I'm just going to do this for can you tell us what kinds of persuasion have you done with teachers that may struggle with that? Bribery?
No, not so much bribery. I think that I come to it from a place of, when I meet with a teacher, it's really about what do you need that this student to do to show you that they understand what you're trying to teach, and really put it back on them and give them the power to be able to say, if they do X, Y, and Z, I will feel comfortable with that.
Great. That's a beautiful tip. Thank you. I'm going to hold two. Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay. Yes.
Another question here.
Oh, where are we? Oops. Hi. This is the funnest part. I feel like Oprah.
That's cool. So just as actually in response to what you just said, how you get teachers to.
Yes.
So sometimes I'll say, I work in an alternative program,
And your role?
is a special education liaison. I'm also a co-teacher in a junior American lit class.
Wow. God bless you.
Yeah.
God bless you all.
But
But
that's all I know. So,
yeah.
so sometimes I'll
Wait a sec. I just have to pause you.
Yeah.
Glue the glitter. I just blessed you, and you said, "Oh well, that's the one I know." Like, take it in. I'm saying bless. See that it's just. I'm just telling you, it's a growth curve for educators to glue the glitter, and I'm just practicing. Sorry to
But
put you
it's
on the
true.
spot.
So
Okay.
This is all I know.
Yes.
This is what I do. And so sometimes if I have a student who has been hospitalized and is coming back to school, and this may be,
Can you hear over there?
It may be a high-performing student, might be an honor student, AP student. It may be someone who's not, who struggles with school. And if teachers have a problem with modifying amount, scope and sequence, whatever it may be, if they are really rigid teachers, I will say, this student was just hospitalized with suicidal ideation. Do not give him or her any more work. Let them sit in class. Let's see how that goes. And that sometimes is required.
Yes,
Is that okay?
I say whatever works. I am a very practical person. I mean, sometimes you're the bind that you can't share because the family hasn't allowed you to share that there's suicidal ideation, so you might have to say it in code.
Yes.
I'm just saying for folks that might be newer at this, because you probably intuitively know that there's a language that you shift into that that you
And
use.
sometimes it needs to be said very directly and explicitly.
Give me a model of that. Hey, look, whoops, I need my second thing because our online people can't do it. All right, let's just do a quick role play. You know what? Johnny hasn't come to school. It's been 3 weeks. What do you want? You want him to graduate being stupid?
No, we want him to graduate. We want him to be alive.
But I don't want to push him.
I understand.
What do you understand about that?
Because you are his English teacher and he's missed this amount of work and the rest of the class is here.
3 weeks, and when he comes to class, he's sleeping.
So if he's sleeping, let him know that he can either go back to his safe space, his team, or he can go to the nurse. Give him those two options.
He goes to the nurse and he spends an hour and a half and he comes sauntering in and he's missed the class. I'm sorry, I'm being such a pain.
No, that's good. No, you're that's good. Would you like to come and sit with us in our team and possibly discuss some of the things that we know that have helped this particular student? Would that be helpful for you?
Yes. Thank you. That was beautiful. God bless Lexington High School. Okay. And Lynn, too. All right. Y'all are so smart. There's like 4,000 years of smartness in this room. I'm really intimidated. Okay. Here's another one, whether to fail for absenteeism. That's a big one. One of the things just to share that I heard from a district, and some of the districts you may already do this, is having a special grading around medical absences. So it's an M grade. So if you get a letter from a therapist or a medical doctor that the term is not counted in their grade for that quarter. So no grade stress. So you calculate if the child has missed the second semester, you calculate the first and the third semester. And it's in some classes it's easier in English and it might be harder in science and math, but it creates a system. And for any of you who have questions about it, I know Newton Public Schools are doing that and there are other districts that are doing that too. This is a hard one. Participation in extracurriculars if poor attendance. So you get in this circular thing, right? The only reason a kid is coming to school is because they're going to go track, or they're going to be in the drama play, or they're going to be in government, and they don't have enough attendance, so then they're not allowed to do that, and now you've dropped the motivation. So again, being realistic, I don't know how to solve this. I've actually gone to some random place in the middle of nowhere that you go to a board that talks about where people can play football to plead the case, and I lost. So I know, maybe you all know what I'm talking about. It allows people to play football, and it makes all the rules in it. Pardon? MIAA, thank you. So it's a hard one, but I think just as you were talking about rigidity, I think educators sometimes get very rigid about that and we lose kids. And I loved what you said, like, we're talking about trying to keep this kid alive. That's a big thing. It's a big thing. It's what I've spent the last 25 years working on. So yes, we want to get kids educated, but we may have to change the timeline of that. So, okay, we're going to have a couple more comments about this. The timetable about reentry. So This is a little bit, and I'm going to be talking about it later, about motivational interviewing. But it's hard sometimes, because sometimes what people say is we need to desensitize the child, so we're going to have them come in for half an hour, and then they're going to come in for 45 minutes, and then they're going to come in for an hour, and then we're going to sort of do a gradual transition. But then sometimes you're stuck because the kid actually gets into the school, and now they have a momentum. And how do you stick with the timetable that's been orchestrated by perhaps an outside clinician, or do you modify it? I would say use your clinical judgment. Many times, outside clinicians do not have the information that you have, but that's a decision you want to be thinking about and talking about with outside clinicians when they come up with plans. This is a big one, criteria for sending to emergency room. So Children's Hospital did a great presentation at my school mental health conference, and they talked about, to take a look in your district, whether you have criteria for sending kids to the emergency room. So this is for the kid that may have had a meltdown as they got into the classroom, or became aggressive because they wanted to call their mother and you're holding the line, and then they escalate. Be really mindful as a district. What is the threshold for calling the emergency room? And what data to provide the emergency room? And this is a big one. We've certainly seen it in the recent school shootings. What do you do if the parent drops the ball when you've made a referral? And how do you manage that? And when you call the family to tell them that you've sent them to the emergency room, make sure you include observable behavior. And I would say, be careful when you send them to the emergency room, because many times kids show up in the emergency room, they were escalated at school, 5 hours sitting in the emergency room. The ER docs, and I've done 30 years of supervising psychiatrists who are in the emergency room, says this kid doesn't meet criteria for admission. And you've now just made a hostility between the parent and the school, and you have the child show up, if you're lucky, in the classroom the next day, or stay home because the parent's afraid that they're going to end up getting bounced to the emergency room. Big million-dollar question, when to intensify services, whether we can even get services, and that could take another, but thinking about how you've roadmapped the services that are available, that are realistically available. One of the travesties in mental health services is how much, it's impossible to get any service, but it's easier to get an individual service than it is to get family therapists and good, seasoned family therapists. And so it's just highlighting that. But thinking about how you manage that. Another pet peeve I have, what I've seen, child requires assistance and probation officers. I see that usually it's lower socioeconomic status kids who get the CRA. And the reason they get it is because administrators feel like kids haven't, the parents haven't followed through, but the parents might struggle because of all the demands that they have and the job challenges. So it's just to have you all think about CRA and probation officers. And then the other million-dollar place of conflict, and it's something for you all to think about in terms of outcomes, is when to do an out-of-district placement. How many of you have that discussion? Yeah. And what I would say, what I know from having been on both sides, if a kid is sick enough that they end up in an inpatient unit, you have many inpatient clinicians who may not be able to get a hold of the school or may not get permission from the parents to be able to talk to the school. And it ends up being a polarizing situation because the inpatient may say an out-of-district placement needs to happen, and they're not aware of all the efforts that you're making to get this child in the door. And The director of special ed may say, why am I going to pay $70,000 for a kid to go in an out-of-district placement when they may not get on the bus? I would say it's just a really important discussion to have because I've seen it both ways. I've seen kids who won't go into a school that has 2,000 kids who can make it in a therapeutic residential placement. And you know, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the BRITE program, B-R-I-T-E if you're not, but definitely there's been a major effort to build resources within the school to help with that transition, but that's another. So those are the decisions that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just tell you 2 programs. There's a reason I'm going to talk about these 2 interventions. Check and Connect is a research-based intervention to increase student engagement. And it creates systems for documenting the outreach, and it requires sustained efforts by a school mentor where they have school mentors that sign on for 2 years, and the mentors check on absences, behavior referrals, and grades, and they connect by providing personalized interventions to help solve problems and build skills. What I like most, though, and this again comes from my threat assessment work, if you don't write it down, it doesn't matter. So with Check and Connect, they have both an app and they also have a form, and I like the documentation because sometimes when I've been asked to do psychiatric assessments on kids with school avoidance, when I'm interviewing school people, they tell me of exhaustive effort to outreach to the student, but it's not always documented. And I like some of the things that they have in this. They have academic data, behavior data, and communication. They also have facilitating goal setting, and they talk about what are the things that they're trying, teaching problem-solving skills, teaching organization and study skills, arranging alternatives to suspension. So that, it's just, again, just a reminder when you go back to your team about what are we doing to document our outreach. I saw you raise your hand. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
My question is about kind of how to house these kinds of tracking systems because we don't want them in a CUME file,
Yep.
right? And we are not supposed to have, at this point, kind of student files outside of the CUME file. And they don't necessarily travel up through the grades.
Yeah.
And maybe they shouldn't because maybe some of it is resolved. And then
Yes. So great question. I actually don't know the answer. I bet you Check and Connect could tell you that answer. I'm going to find out the answer. What I can tell you is that with Dewey Cornell, who does schoolta.com, which for any of you who want to know brilliant threat assessment training, it's Dewey Cornell's site, schoolta.com, and I don't get a kickback for that endorsement. He's my go-to for when there's been a school shooting or when I have to write anything about school threat assessments. He's on speed dial. I've got good people on speed dial, and I'm glad you're having him to your conference. Terrific.
It's great. And if I could just help with that, there are several programs, software packages that you can buy that house these separately. I would also advise you to work with your school counsel, your school attorney on what
Nice.
they will,
Yeah.
because that's ultimately where it's going to lie. But we are also at that conference, we will have Mary Ellen Swarter, who's an attorney in education, speak about some of those issues as well. So
Great. Yeah.
that's a plug for our conference. Thanks.
Nice. So there's a question online. Yay. Let's take it.
What's the best way to get rigid teachers on board with creative grading and re-entry?
Yeah. Okay, that's the $1 million question, right? I think one is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Robert Brooks. He invented the whole idea of islands of competency. And when he teaches my child fellows, one of the things he says is you have to build a relationship with the teacher and find out what's getting in the way of them being able to feel connected and being able to extend that compassion. I remember a student where I did a threat assessment and they had done a image of, thank you. I had done a threat assessment. I said, build a relationship with the teacher and find compassion for that teacher is really hard to do when you feel like a teacher is angry at a student or stepping on their toes or actually, quite frankly, sometimes being a little bit sadistic. And which I adore teachers. Don't get me wrong, please, everybody know that I've devoted my life to teachers. So I'm not trash talking teachers, but we have challenges, right? And what I found in that threat assessment with a teacher who was very frightened of this kid is that he had drawn a picture of a gun in her U.S. History Revolution class and had drawn a picture in the U.S. History Civil War using a gun that was an updated gun of the year 2012. And when I did the evaluation, what came out was this was a teacher who had had trauma happen to her, and it was getting in the way. I mean, once we said this is a transient threat, and it really was a transient threat. It was a student who made a poor judgment about what to draw on a piece of paper. What I was able to do is to learn about what was dragging her down, what was interfering. So I would say with a rigid teacher, it's going to take more time of being open and curious, the way that we would talk about working with parents who are school avoidant. So this is another intervention that I wanted to talk to you about. It's the big picture questions about how do we communicate with parents on a systemic level. And what you're looking at is a parent log that actually was from New York City to access information about their child's progress. And there were way too many barriers. You had to have the student ID, the number from the report card, a code from the school. Well, guess what? It's not going to happen in our high-risk kids. And so, fast forward to 2019. And there was a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School. You can find him. His name is Todd Rogers. And he's worked with school districts to reduce friction. And what you're seeing is an automated text message that parents receive when their kids are starting to slip with grades and absences. And having this information proactively shared increased their awareness of their child's behavior and resulted in absences decreasing, get this, by 10%. So it's Todd Rogers, go back to your school district, find out how you communicate about school absences. And here's another clever, and he'll help you, hopefully, for the right price. And this is the next thing that I wanted to show you, which is this was showing the school absences of their child, the one on the right, compared to other kids in their class, so that kids could get that they could get that percentage, and that made a difference. So we're going to move to talking about families and family interaction. So let me just go through, though, some of the things that I think are pitfalls that we may find and that we should be thinking about. Does the family have a shared understanding of the problem and shared motivation to solve it? That's a really important question, because many times they don't. And I like this. I got this from a family therapist that helped train me. What he says is, this takes courage to say what I'm about to tell you. Are you willing to put aside your differences? Are you willing to put aside your differences to work together to save your child? Okay, that's heavy, but it's important. And I can promise you, having used those phrases, it gets the attention of the parents. It says, we have a higher goal here than you all being in a pissing contest. And are you willing to put that aside? So that's a question I would offer to you. I did, after the pandemic, I worked with when the pandemic started, I worked with the Boston parochial school system. I liked what they did. maybe we can't do it in the public school system, but I certainly have done it with my private patients when I'm really stuck. They pray before they start the meeting. But something that conveys a faith, I think, is really important when you're working with these families. And then the other thing I thought that's really important to communicate to parents, this is super important, you guys, just to highlight what I'm about to say. How you do this is not as important as that you do it together. Okay? That seems obvious, right? But it really doesn't. If you decide that, I don't know, Lloyd, give me an example that you might have where two parents are disagreeing on a strategy.
A lot of times it's when
Speak up real loud because the online folks.
A lot of times when the home is split,
Yep.
and so you have a dad and one, and
Yep.
mom and another child is with mom, and dad goes, nope, this is how we should do it. You don't live here. What do you mean this is how we should do it?
Yeah.
It just turns into this.
Yes.
So a lot of times I've had to step into the middle, be the referee,
Yes.
right? Redirect their focus on the child.
Yeah.
Here's the child's problem. Here's what we need to focus on. How can we
Yep.
solve that together?
Yep.
And let's reset from that point.
So can you give us, because that's intimidating. You look like a very persuasive
But
man.
I'm a teddy bear. Which
Thank you. I'm so glad you're a teddy bear. So that probably comes across when you're working with folks. Can you give me an example of when you've done that and you've turned the Titanic, where you've been able to actually take two parents that are in a conflict and then been able to shift the dynamic? Just take a moment.
Yeah. Trying to. I'm going through the Rolodex
Sure.
of situations. So I've had it where parents didn't necessarily agree with how we, the school, were doing things. And so what I ended up having to do in that situation is just go through everything the school has done up until that point.
Yep.
And then ask, where do you think we could have done better?
Nice.
And then as they started going, well, you have called us 10 times. You did file the CRA.
Yeah.
You did put our kids in what we call the bridge program, gives them an opportunity to kind
Yeah.
of acclimate back in.
Yep.
You did visit our house twice. You did. And so when I ask what we could have done better,
Yeah.
then it kind of dials things down
Yes.
a little
Yeah.
bit. And then I go, all right, so as a result of that, let's reset.
Yep.
And then
I love what you're saying because it complements the check and connect. What you're saying is I went through the checklist of what we did, and by doing that, I was able to make that connection with, I was reinforcing the connection between school and parents and saying we're actually on the same team.
Right.
And shifting that. Thank you. Okay. So, can they agree on a timeline? Sort of goes back to what you're saying about what can they agree on the steps that need to be taken? And what's the family value system around school? So when I had a family where the father really felt like if my kid doesn't go to school for the next 2 years, I'm fine with that because I'm afraid if I push this student, they're going to end up killing themselves. And that's my son. And I'd rather have them in jail because the student was doing some things that were not legal, or out of school than dead. And the mother was like, I need to get him out of the house because he's online all the time. So this conflict around what's the family value system around school. And this is a tough one. I guess sometimes I'm not always coming up with the solution, but I'm trying to give you guys a map of what we're up against. Okay. Questions for the family to consider. These are called circular questions. Who's the least or most concerned about the problem? What will happen if it doesn't get resolved? What will happen if it does get resolved? Who outside the family is concerned about it? What have they done to try to fix it? And how did that work? So it goes back to what we were talking about. Helping families. I mean, I don't know about you all, but when I'm feeling helpless, I don't know how to ask for help. And sometimes I need somebody else to remind me that I don't have to do it alone. So keeping that in your mind when you're talking with a family, because maybe there's someone they haven't thought about. Maybe there is an involved minister or a grandparent or a coach or somebody that might be able to do it. And I've already talked about how parents need to walk like they've got the gold in their pocket. And another aspect is that many times when families are stuck, the conversation ends up gravitating towards going to school, going to school, going to school. And I always encourage families to also step back and think about whether they can have positive time that's not just talking about it. Many times when parents are struggling with their kids, they feel helpless. And that's one of the reasons I've worked with teenagers for 25 years, because I love thinking about where's the leverage. This comes from the adolescent substance abuse program in Children's Hospital. They talk about the 5 C's. I would update it for the 6 C's, but there's cash, credit card, car, computer, console, and cell phone. But reminding parents where the leverage is. All right, now we're at the Ahmal case and we have no minutes. So I'm going to have us talk quickly about it. I'm going to share it with you, and I'm going to take 3 teaching points from you all and then move into some things that I want to share. So as I'm talking, I want you to think about the individual factors that I'm talking about, the family factors, and school factors. This is a case with a 16-year-old senior from Pakistan. In his freshman year, he participated on the football team and did relatively well in school. He dropped out of football after a concussion. Junior year, he was caught plagiarizing by another student's work. Beginning of senior year, he had a physical fight with another student who called him derogatory names. And he's missed over 30 days of school. And this year has complained of stomach aches and headaches. And his mother suspects that he's smoking marijuana daily. And he spends most of the time out of school online and is involved in cryptocurrency trading. So his parents disagree on how to set limits on his internet use and how to get him back in school. So I want to give you all, let's say, 5 minutes to discuss what you would do with this case. Just turn and talk to each other about what you would do with this case. It's an easy case, but I'm sure it's a case that you like this, an archetypal case that you've seen. I went around the tables, and in the interest of time, since we only have 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you what some people shared. One of the things they talked about, which seemed consistent, was the idea that maybe he needed to be medically evaluated, both for the concussion and the fact that he might have depression, and whether he had an outside clinician that was providing support for that. The other thing was recognizing that he had a loss of self-esteem from having been kicked off not being able to play on the football team. Could you recruit the football coach possibly to have some more interaction with it, or is there a role that he might be willing to play on the football team, or helping him, going back to Jeff Peratti's point about friends and how important it is to kind of be lifted up with the connection to friends. And then there was the question about finding a favorite adult in the building, which talks again about identifying maybe the coach. And then I love the one about substance abuse, which is, it's really hard right now to address substance abuse when you can basically buy marijuana in lots of storefronts and it's really easy access. But thinking with the parent, the outside therapist, and the student and the school counselor about how to address that. So I'm going to go through in 5 minutes and then open it up for questions. What I think are points that I would want you to take away with this. Too many times we do not identify criteria for sending a child home. So this is a shout out to school nurses who do an amazing job many times with the school avoidant children, and that physical symptoms that may allow school absence, having a letter from the doctor that describes that. And here are some that I think are useful. severe flu-like or asthmatic symptoms, severe diarrhea, bleeding, frequent vomiting, and temperature. These are screening instruments that I'm sharing with you. This is for school counselors, psychologists, comes from a lecture I had at the HMS School Mental Health Conference. These are good tools to use if you have a question of substance abuse. Of course, it's always a worry a little bit depending on how liberal your special ed department is. Some special ed departments will say if we identify substance use, we now knock the kid out of getting services because that's the primary service. I hope that's not your district. So it's a little dicey if you're going to use it, but these are 3 good tools. Motivational interviewing. I think, first of all, this is really important with new school counselors to really highlight and so just to run through for people who might not be familiar, pre-contemplation means that basically you don't identify it as a problem. Contemplation means, oh, you're thinking maybe not going to school is not such a great idea, but you're not really going to move to do it, and then action. It's within the addiction is where we talk a lot about motivational interviewing, but I also think it's helpful with thinking about school avoidance, and that if you get a student to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, it's like fertilizing soil. It's a really big step. So it's a reminder to new school counselors that may be new in the field, because sometimes you may feel like you're not making a difference. Next is rolling with resistance. That's one I think that's a really good one to be thinking about with motivational interviewing. It means, oh, so you're not going to go to school. It's not the kind of conversation that a parent can easily have because it presses their panic button. But you may be able to have it with your students. And the other one I really, really love, it's actually really good with narcissistic, self-centered patients. You ask permission. Do you really want to know this? Make them beg, okay? You sure you want me to talk to you about this? All right. Change talk versus sustained talk. There's an acronym they have, DARN, which means you look at the desire to change, the ability to change, the reasons to change, and the need to change, DARN. And having that kind of discussion with a student really highlights moving them to thinking about change. And they may say things like, I want to feel less anxious. And I like this graph I'll show. What does it take to change? So what you're looking at is on the x-axis is how important to change, and on the y-axis is how confident are you that you can change. And it just concretizes having that discussion. This is another image that I had from one of my students, the do's and don'ts. They were having classmates brainstorm ways of talking to someone who's depressed. And here are some of the things they came up with, which struck me as relevant to working with school avoidant kids and their families as well. So do. Notice. Notice them, don't accuse them. Give routine attention. Don't assume you know the answer. Check-ins that aren't about mental health. Don't invalidate feelings. Give direct, clear questions. Do fun things. And share responsibility. So this is a great app that allows kids to have 3-minute exercises that are sort of encapsulated DBT kinds of things that I've had patients like. Next slide is just another DBT app, which you'll have in your PowerPoint, and this is just talking more about distress tolerance. This actually, I love HALT, that comes from Dan Siegel's work. That somehow sticks more than the DBT stuff sometimes. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. We could use it for all of us as a checklist around what gets in the way of us functioning. This is just the miracle question I still love. Suppose you go to sleep tonight and when you wake up, the problem is gone. What will be the first sign that this miracle occurred? So I want to circle back to that student who talked about the inner light in each of our students, and the idea that we want to hold on to In William Sloane Coffin's words, the passion for the possible. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being here today.